So the quiet in the room suggests that it's time to start. So welcome to Canadian Studies in Turbulent Times, Challenges, Ideas, and Opportunities. Esteemed panelists, special guests, colleagues, students, and friends, good evening and welcome to the School of Canadian Studies Vickers-Verduyn Lecture. I'm Pauline Rankin. I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic at Carleton University, and it's my pleasure to act as your moderator this evening. But before I introduce the panelists and get us started in the evening's proceedings, let me first begin with a land acknowledgement. We gather this evening on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Those of us who are guests on this land must recognize the lingering legacy of colonialism, its continued impact on institutions such as Carleton, and in making this acknowledgement, we recognize our responsibility to engage in meaningful and substantive processes of reconciliation with Indigenous nations. Tonight's event honors the legacy of two important feminist scholars, Dr. Jill Vickers, who is a professor emerita of Carleton University, and Dr. Crystal Verdun, formerly of Trent University, who together collaborated to found a joint doctoral program in Canadian Studies. And the spirit of that program is what we celebrate tonight and annually in a lecture focused on Canadian issues. This evening, we are very excited to use this occasion for a panel presentation on Canadian studies in turbulent times. And we are delighted to have assembled an impressive panel who will offer their thoughts on some of the most pressing issues of the moment in the university sector and how, as a university sector, we begin to offer leadership, comfort, and direction to students in this difficult moment. I know you have overviews of the bios of our panelists on the screens, but if you're sitting at the back, and those might be a bit difficult to see, let me tell you a bit about our panelists. I'll begin with Dr. Jane Philpott. Since 2020, the Honorable Jane Philpott has served as the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences and Director of the School of Medicine at Queen's University. Dr. Philpott is an accomplished family physician, educator, and health champion, and is best known for holding several senior cabinet positions with the Government of Canada. Elected as Member of Parliament for Markham-Stouffville in 2015, she served as Minister of Health, Minister of Indigenous Services, President of the Treasury Board, and Minister of Digital Government. Prior to entering politics, she spent 30 years in family medicine and global health. She received her Doctorate of Medicine from the University of Western Ontario and later earned a Master of Public Health from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Her latest accomplishment, which is getting, as we say, a lot of buzz, is the newly released book, Health for All, A Doctor's Prescription for a Healthier Canada. Beside me is Professor Adrian Harewood, who joined Carleton School of Journalism in 2021 and is a well-known and highly respected journalist for over 25 years. Adrian was the host of CBC Ottawa's radio show All in a Day, anchor of CBC Ottawa Television News at 6, and the guest host of innumerable national radio and television programs, including The Current, As It Happens, The House, and Power and Politics. He boasts an incredible list of interviewees. And why I am monitoring this panel tonight instead of Adrian Harewood is one of life's great mysteries, but I digress. Professor Harewood holds an MA in history from Carleton, and since joining our faculty, he has been extremely instrumental in transforming journalism's curriculum through innovations such as creating the first course focused on race, a graduate seminar called Journalism, Race, and Diversity, as well as designing the first course in Canada devoted to the history of Black Canadian journalism. Senator Yuen has served as a senator from British Columbia since 2016. Senator Wu has a long career of expertise on public policy issues related to Canada's relationship to Asian countries. From 2005 to 2014, he was president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, during which time he also served on the Standing Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council as chair of that council's State of the Region report. He is a joint chair of the Standing Joint Committee for the Scrutiny of Regulations and a senior fellow at Simon Fraser University's Graduate School of Business. Senator Wu has been the president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and at the time of his appointment to Senate, Senator Wu was a senior fellow in public policy at the Asian Institute of Research at the University of British Columbia. And finally, Mr. Frank Graves. Frank Graves is founder and president of EKOS Research Associates, Inc. He is one of the country's leading applied social researchers, directing some of the largest and most challenging social research assignments on topics such as the economy, immigration, defense and security, healthcare, the environment, and national unity in Canada and Canada-US relations. He is frequently looked to for advice by private and public sector decision-making. Mr. Graves has published widely in academic and mainstream publications and has lectured at the Rotman School of Business, the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs in Washington. And we claim Mr. Graves as a graduate of Carleton, holding both a BA in social anthropology and an MA in sociology. And he continues to share his knowledge by teaching at Carleton. And now to our format for the evening. Each panelist will offer some introductory observations on a question posed to them in advance. And then we'll have a dialogue among our panelists, followed by time for questions from the audience. So let's get started. I've asked our panelists to offer 3 to 4 minutes, I'll give them 5, of introductory thoughts on the following question. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau offered a vision of Canada as a just society. In 2024, however, that just society seems even more unattainable. In a moment marked by disinformation and distrust of public institutions, science, and the value of higher education, attacks on democracy, backlashes against equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, and declining support for example, immigration, just to name a few of the troubling trends we're witnessing, what is the role of Canadian universities in this turbulent context? I'm going to ask Dean Philpott if she would begin.
Oh, well, thank you for putting me on the spot first. So thank you, Provost Rankin, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. It's such a challenging topic, and I hope that somehow we'll be able to come up with a few key points together. So in terms of your question, I am really, one of the things I love about being at Queen's University now is that I do get to spend a lot of time with young people, as most of you do, being in the campus context. And I get to hear the things that they're worried about. I also happen to have 4 children who are not that far into adulthood themselves, and so I get to have the input of young people into my listening ears quite regularly. And you're quite right, young people are of course facing, I think one could argue, unprecedented levels of existential angst about the direction that the world is going, the future of the planet, and this divided society where they wonder who to trust. And one of the things I would say that I have found has been helpful is to make sure that we match our actions to our words. So what I hear from young people who don't trust authority is that they hear people in positions of power who say the right things and don't always act in the same way that they speak in terms of issues like equity, diversity, and inclusion, for example. And in terms of being a just society, that we have to do more than just speak about justice, we have to actually take just actions. So one of the things we've tried to do at Queen's University, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done, is to take a number of very pragmatic steps to demonstrate our belief in a just society. So if I may use the medical school as an example, since that's where I spend a lot of my time, we've been really excited about new initiatives where, for example, we've broadened a partnership that we've had for a long time with the Winnebago Area Health Authority, located in the western side of the James Bay coast. And rather than being a place that is simply a recipient of clinical cases and occasional students from the James Bay Coast, we've actually launched an initiative to take our campus to the James Bay Coast and are working on developing Indigenous informed curricula to teach nursing and medicine and other courses based in Moosonee for students there. We've also done some really, what we think and what others in the post-secondary sector think are fairly courageous steps. In fact, one of them you might have heard about last week, where we announced that we're changing our admissions protocols for the medical school because we believe that some of the current approaches to admission privilege people who have exceptional opportunities that are not available to the broader population. And we've actually inserted a lottery process so that every qualified candidate who meets an appropriate bar for achievement of their GPA and their MCAT scores, every one of those students has an equal chance of being able to get an interview. And I'm happy to talk about other steps that we've taken, but I think showing students that we mean what we say has definitely raised some attention among the students and built an enormous amount of trust there. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm sure I might probably be past my 5 minutes, but you know, when I think about Pierre Trudeau and the Just Society, he led us in a way that inspired all of us, and I was a young person at the time that he was Prime Minister, that inspired us to give back and to serve. And you know, maybe this will come up later in the conversation, but I think one of the challenges that we have faced as a society through these recent years is that we've become, I think it's fair to say, and maybe Frank can tell me if this is true, but I think we've become much more self-centered, and we've not challenged our students nor ourselves to see not what others can do for us, but what we can do for others. And a just society requires a call to the young people who are amongst us to say, what do you want to do to give back to society? And I think that increasingly it has been my perspective that we have lowered the bar of our expectations of public service amongst ourselves, and that we've done that because we thought that would protect us and make us feel safer, but in fact it has had the opposite effect. And when we've increasingly looked inward, we have felt less and less well. And in fact, what I argue in my book helps people to feel well is when we look outward and when we are imbued with hope and belonging and meaning and purpose in our lives.
Adrian.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge just the passing of an iconic Canadian journalist, Robert McNeill, who passed away a couple of days ago. And of course, famously from the McNeill-Lehrer Report, but he was also a Carleton alumnus, graduated in 1955. So I thought I would just mention that and acknowledge his passing. I took your assignment seriously, so
Good.
I wrote something, you know, and so I apologize, but I'm gonna read from the proverbial teleprompter.
Okay.
All right now. So to answer your question, I think the role of the Canadian University in these turbulent times is to remain steadfast in its commitment to its mission, which I believe is to affirm the value of the examined life, the value of questioning. The Canadian University's role should be to cultivate an intellectual ecosystem in which the minds of its students are, to quote Martha Nussbaum, liberated from the bondage of habit and custom. Part of its role should be to educate and nurture people who can function with sensitivity and alertness as citizens of the whole world. The Canadian University's role is to uphold our collective humanity and enable all peoples to become more human beings. I think the university's role is to promote a pedagogy of care that doesn't seek to indoctrinate students, but rather to help open their critical minds. A pedagogy that neither patronizes nor panders, that values compassion, acts with empathy, and demands accountability. A pedagogy that enables its charges to become agents of change and stewards of the earth in this age of climate change. The Canadian University's role is to be a place of imagination and discovery, a place of risk, whimsy, and freedom dreams, a place of invention and innovation where research is conducted and knowledge is generated and disseminated in a multiplicity of forms. The Canadian University's role is to serve as a model of how we can engage in vigorous conversations across difference, how we can learn to disagree and yet honor each other's inherent dignity, how we can learn how to comport ourselves with others in a way that honors ourselves and other beings, where we can learn to negotiate the way in which we want to live with each other. Its role, I think, is to safeguard spaces where people can challenge power and criticize, dissent, and protest freely. I think the role of the Canadian University is to provide a place where we can rethink, reconsider, revise, reinvent our ways of being, a place where new stories can be told and considered, where old stories can be disputed, debunked, but also resurrected. The role of the Canadian University is to harness the knowledge and resources contained in its classrooms, laboratories, and amphitheaters to create sites of possibility and opportunity for the communities and neighborhoods in its midst. I think part of the Canadian University's role is to acknowledge and honor our collective obligations to the past, the present, and the future, and to provide a space where we can work out the nature of our obligations to each other. The role of the Canadian University is to provide a space where all communities and people can be recognized, and those who have been historically misrecognized can tell their stories. And the university's role can be to become a site where we can candidly discuss the matter of colonialism, domination, and control, where we can talk about power, how it actually operates, and how it needs to be reimagined and restructured so that we can imagine a just future in which our children and their children and their children's children have good relations. And finally, I think the university's role as a vital institution in society is to recognize that the people who live on the territory called Canada on Turtle Island are unfinished. They are unfinished, but they are in the process of becoming.
Very inspirational. Thank you, Adrian. I'll turn the podium over to Senator Wu.
Well, I don't have anything quite as eloquent and well developed as Mr. Harewood's manifesto, but I want to go to that. I want to go to that university, that place he just described. Maybe I can start by commenting on the diagnosis that you offered prior to the question, the diagnosis of alienation, if I can put it that way, among young people because of maybe lack of trust, lack of hope, a sense that they are facing temporal as well as maybe existential threats, both to do with jobs and housing and income, but also climate change, nuclear war, serious conflicts. All of that diagnosis is accurate, and it's borne out by a variety of research that we've seen in recent years. I'm sure Frank will elaborate on it, but I'll just draw your attention to the very recently released World Happiness Report, which is produced by a group of Canadian scholars led by John Harewood, formerly at UBC, still at UBC but emeritus. And he found something very interesting, which is that Canadians are reasonably happy on average. We're kind of middle of the pack when it comes to our peer group. But what was striking is the difference between Canadians over 60 and Canadians under 30. And the gap in their happiness perceptions, self-identified perceptions, was more than 45 spots in the rank order. Frank knows this better than I do, and he may correct me if I'm wrong. But on average, we were around 15, I think it was, 15 in the rank order, but young people were 58 in their happiness perceptions. So the diagnosis is correct. The question is why? And I just want to pick up on Dr. Philpott's comment about how people in general, but I think young people as well, find meaning and happiness. And one of those correlates is serving, doing good. You can call it volunteering, or you can call it charity, or whatever you want to call it, but doing something other than serving your own interests. And in fact, Dr. Halliwell and his colleagues were able to identify volunteering or philanthropic type work as a correlate of self-identified happiness. So there's, I mean, it's not hard science, but there is a basis for thinking about how we improve our lot, which we have control over. Now, to your question about what this means for a university, and just teeing off the reference to the Just Society, I would say that universities need to talk about what a just society is. And I don't know whether this is a part of the core curriculum that can be introduced, or some kind of cross-cutting short program that all students can take. But we all need to talk about what we mean by a just society. It doesn't have to be, political philosophy. This is not about Rawls as such. It could be about Rawls, but it could be about a range of other political philosophies. But we need to talk about justice in Canada in all of its dimensions. So there's the question of a just society intergenerationally, right? So we just talked about it, young and old. We've got to talk about justice between First Nations and settlers. We need to talk about justice regionally, how we work that through. We need to talk about a just society insofar as immigrants are concerned. When Trudeau Père, was in charge, there weren't as many immigrants as there are today. The landscape has changed. And the way he and others may have thought about immigration in the 60s and 70s is different today. Today, immigrants like myself, are a very large body of individuals concentrated in a number of cities. What does justice mean for this new configuration of the population? And then we need to think about cross-national, transnational, cross-border justice as well. What do we mean when we think of Canada as a country that believes in a just society applied across countries? Does it mean that we should pursue economic and other policies that probably have benefit for us, narrowly speaking, but could immiserize or harm the prospects of other countries? These are the questions that I would hope that young people have the opportunity to discuss. I know that Simon Fraser University, where I have spent some time, doesn't have a theory of justice course for everyone, but it does have something they call a semester in dialogue. And this is the idea that all students need to learn how to talk to each other. I don't actually know the details of that course, but the logic, I think, is sound. SFU recognized early on that students didn't know how to talk to each other outside of their little cohorts and classes and so on, and so put in place this idea of a course in dialogue. So some of these types of programs that encourage reflection on the country we want, the society we want, and reflection on how we talk to people with different points of view may be helpful.
Great, thank you. Mr. Graves.
Well, we must be out of time now. So, but I feel somewhat embarrassed to come after those eloquent presentations, but let me try and take a shot at a few facts and evidence that I think might support a little more deeper thinking on these questions, which are very difficult ones. I was struck by the idea that the Just Society, which was an idea that came a long time ago, actually was sort of a response to a Canadian interpretation, I guess, or variation on what was called the Great Society from LBJ in the United States. What was interesting is both those movements were unified by a belief that, first of all, there was a public interest, which has been shattered in recent years. There's no homogeneous public interest anymore. But that public interest could be pursued through the use of social indicators would look at quality and not just quantity. It was a very heady idea and a heady period. If we think back, Canada at that time, our median age was 26. It went down to 41 last year. It was going on the way to 43, and immigration has actually pulled it down, which is one of the many benefits hidden. But the incidence of Canadians who were members of visible minorities was probably about 5%. It's now 27% and rising quickly. So it's a very different country and with very different aspirations. And if I fast forward and look at the country today, and I would like to focus on this issue of the intergenerational fractures that we see today, because they're unique and disturbing. And by the way, talking about generation in a homogeneous sense really ignores the fact that there are vast differences between young men and young women, which are things we wouldn't have seen in the past. And I'm glad to get into that later. But if I fast forward and look at the picture that I see evolving today, first of all, you could see that sort of perhaps naive but noble pursuit of the idea of a kind of ideologically neutral calculus of decision making that would be formed by empirical social indicators. That's wonderful. And that it kind of evolved to the idea that the key to a better future would be knowledge and education, and that this would produce things like the end of history as we went along this path, which would then produce the kind of rise of what was called, neoliberalism, a third way, and the whole idea that let's rethink about how economies are going to work. They're going to be based on human capital, not conventional capital. They're going to be floated on globalization, information technology, business cycles will be ended, everything's going to be great. And where do we see ourselves today? And part of the disappointment, I think, in the current generation is that whole neoliberal model, whether it was a third way or whatever we saw in Canada, it turned out to be a bit of I'm not going to say fraud, but it certainly didn't. The ascendance of human capital and knowledge never happened. What we've seen demonstrably and emphatically is the rise of good old-fashioned capital with a hyper-concentration of wealth which resembles the highest periods of the original Gilded Age, which we know collapsed in the Great Depression. But if I look at the indicators, I'm just going to kind of briefly summarize. I've never seen this country this dark and divided. We can comfort ourselves. Maybe it's not quite as bad as the United States, but the same dynamics are at play. So if I were to pick indicators, like key indicators of social indicators that typically move in a glacial fashion, like our values, they're inverting and moving at rates we've never seen, our sources of identity. Attachment to country is by far the lowest it's ever been this country. I had the dubious pleasure of briefing the Unity Cabinets 2 days after the referendum, and things looked unimaginably better in terms of the cohesion in the country at that moment than they do in Canada today. The lowest, and it's not like that's being replaced by, country's off, but I'm getting attached to my community or to my province. Those are all down at record lows as well. You almost have nihilism in a sense that the typical kind of moral anchors or normative anchors that produce social cohesion are unraveling. And on top of that, to make it even worse, we're seeing degrees of polarization which make it impossible to talk about Canada as any sort of a unified whole. The level of polarization, and the polarization is not just simply, I don't agree with you about the issue A or B. If you don't agree with me, I really don't like you. I wish you didn't live on my street. I don't want my daughter to date you. And this level of I just don't like you has risen in a disturbing fashion. But whether you pick your indicator, okay, for example, immigration, I won't go through the full list. We found as little as 4 years ago, the lowest opposition to immigration we'd seen in 35 years of tracking. 14% of Canadians, too many immigrants coming to the country, almost none. We avoided this postmodern riddle which was tearing apart Europe and America. The last time I measured it, which was only 2 weeks ago, was 57%, by far the highest number I've ever seen. And that's risen in a fashion we never said. I look at, do you think the country overall is moving in the right or wrong direction? Worst score ever. Are you going to be better off or worse off next year than you are today? Worst score ever. You pick, is the external world over the last 5 years become more dangerous, less dangerous, about the same? Worst scores ever. I go down these lists and I go, this is unimaginable, because these are core, typically stable indicators of social cohesion and health. And the only thing we can say is that maybe they're not quite as bad as in some other countries. And if I was to kind of find how do we explain it, even though there's all kinds of factors, and let alone what are we going to do about it, because we need to do something about it, because untested, untreated, these kinds of problems can evolve to something even darker and worse. I mean, a lot of what I'm seeing, I mentioned history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. You have to go back 100 years to see the kinds of things, a great pandemic, a war, a system, an economy which is more stratified than the Gilded Age, which collapsed. Those things produced some very bad things in Europe, and some actually very good things in America. The New Deal, kind of an unimaginable set of policy reforms, which produced the rise of the middle class and shared prosperity. And I would argue that idea that neoliberalism was the next iteration turned out to be untrue. If I look at, I'm going to stop in a second. If you look at the incidence of people who are in under 35 Canada, who say, you know what? If I measure how much money I'm making today compared to my father or my mother, in constant dollars I'm doing better, that whole number has been sliding backwards. The incidence of people who say I'm doing better than my parents, for boomers, 70%. Middle class dream. I bought a house, I retired in relative comfort. Gen X, 50, millennials, 35, Gen Z, 20%. And I can back that up with other data which shows that this whole motion of you work hard, innovate, you're going to get a house, retire, it's collapsed. And I believe that's what set in motion the receptivity to all these other forms of polarization. And if we don't deal with putting that genie back in the bottle, which is possible, because we did it once before, 100 years ago, we created a new deal with massive interventions, public high schools, social safety net imported from Bismarck, public high schools, minimum wage, trade unions, massive public works. We can do this, but it's going to require real action. Just to conclude with the university, I think that part of what we're seeing in the university is this kind of polarization across the most educated, and there used to be Galbraith talked about the war of the rich versus the not so rich as being the key one, not war the rich and poor. It's now the well-educated and the not so educated. We see these huge fault lines against college educated and university educated, burning resentment. And you know what? I think there's a lot of reasons for them to feel that way. But if we don't understand, just my last point, to make it all even more daunting, what we're seeing now is the rise of disinformation, things that people know who are promulgating it, which are simply untrue, which are being consumed in large numbers in a way they weren't in the past, that are leaving a portion of our society believing things that are false, that are injurious to the public interest, which are making them deeply mistrustful and angry, and we are not keeping up. So there's some of the challenges I'd like to put forward. I don't have all the answers, I don't have any of the answers, but I think it's important to know what the questions are.
Wow. So when you talk about the shattering of public interest and the loss of social cohesion, I mean, these are issues that universities are preoccupied with trying to rebuild at the moment. But I wanted to pick up first on your last point about disinformation and maybe turn the conversation to Adrian to think about, in this moment where perhaps so many of the things that you're tracking find their roots in disinformation. What is the role of media studies, journalism programs in trying to reestablish the notion of knowable truth and facts?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, first of all, we need more media literacy training. So that's where we start. I think students have to be taught how to read, and they have to be taught to read broadly, to read from many different sources. I think there's a tendency to want to read things that confirm what you believe in, and that's dangerous because it prevents us from, first of all, being capable of just recognizing that others might have points of view that are worth listening to. But we fail then to become, I think, truly critical thinkers. We fail to maybe understand some of the strengths of our own arguments and some of the weaknesses of our arguments as well. So I think, reading broadly, getting information from many different sources is important. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll be brief.
Okay, and this question of not wanting to talk to one who doesn't hold your opinion. I think your idea that you shared with us, Senator Roof, from Simon Fraser is something that I will shamelessly steal and think about if we could do something like that at Carleton. But how do we start to build the ability to have dialogue across differences? And again, I think that Adrian's point about using different kinds of sources is valuable, but it seems to me in the commentary that Mr. Graves has offered is that we've lost that ability to want to to talk across divides. I'm thinking too about the enormous amount of work that is happening on university campuses at the moment around EDI. I think we've made tremendous progress, and at the same time, we know that there are backlashes to those initiatives as well.
Well, I can add to it.
Sure.
So one thing, I think we have to be a lot more intentional, right? In very, very consciously trying to create spaces where our young people can engage in dialogue and have conversations. And I think as a professor, it starts in the classroom, right? So I think that we can model the way in which we should be comporting ourselves when we are confronted by folks who disagree with us. One thing that I try to emphasize in my classes, we'll often have critique sessions, right? Where the students are kind of taught how to give feedback to each other, right? And how to give feedback in a compassionate way, right? So the feedback needs to be rigorous. The feedback needs to be pointed. But it also can be done in a way that doesn't destroy the other person, right? It can be done in a way that actually affirms them and recognizes that they are, like all people, fallible, and they have and that we are all, as I think I said in my opening statement, that we're all in the process of becoming, so that they're learning. I find at times there's a kind of a harshness. There's a kind of an inability to exercise a certain kind of care in our conversations, and that's it's very, very destructive, right? And I think that it doesn't really help us when we are trying to create a kind of space where people understand what civil discourse is. So I think, again, as instructors, that's my primary role. My role is to try to show them different ways of presenting information, different ways of sharing their ideas, different ways, and also just the importance of listening, right? And deep listening. I think that's really important. There's too much talking sometimes, and we have to learn how to step back and recognize that people have other stories to tell, and they have stories to tell that are worth paying attention to.
Thanks. Yeah. Senator Wu, would you like to pick up on, I know that you've done lots of thinking about EDI initiatives, how we move forward in that front.
Yeah, well, let me just validate your observation by referring to another recent survey. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer, and Frank may not have as high a view on that methodology, but they do this every year, and they measure trust among citizens about a variety of questions, and trust is diminishing. This is consistent with what Frank has told us. But the one finding that struck me is that when the Edelman folks asked respondents where they get their most trusted information, the source of information that was most highly trusted was their own friends, their own circle, essentially. And that was above experts, like scientists and so on. So that tells you part of the problem, right? Essentially, we have retreated to our echo chambers, if I can put it that way. Of course, if your circle of friends is diverse, as Adrian is advocating, then it's okay. But if you're simply talking to the people who already share your views and you're just reinforcing. I think, this issue of how we have dialogues that are more civil and so on, it's partly about what the stakes are, right? We are motivated by incentives and penalties and so on. And when the stakes are really high, or they're perceived to be really high, you're going to take a more strident position, you can take a harder position in defending your view. And I'm afraid that many of the debates that we have in this country now have been talked in such a way that the stakes are really high, or at least they're set to be very high. It's about, freedom in this country, or it's about the future of our federation, or the whole a range of a way of talking about these issues that, in a sense, incentivizes different sides of the debate to entrench themselves. So we need to de-escalate a bit. So it's not just about being civil to each other and being willing to listen. If you genuinely feel that the person on the other side of the debate is threatening your fundamental rights or threatening the unity of this country or threatening, you know, the foundation of our economic system, you will be strident and you'll be vigorous in your defense. But we don't have to let debates go in this direction. And this is partly about our political system. You know, the partisan politics has made it about essentially zero-sum games, winner takes all, and that, I think that filters down.
So I want to circle back to thinking about how universities address this with respect to the pedagogy of care. But first, I want to ask Mr. Graves again, how do we get into this mess? At the moment in which universities are so focused on working through people's identities, working on ways to care for students, spending enormous amounts of time and energy thinking about equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, you're saying that we're registering the darkest moments that you've been polling.
Yeah, and it's not just my research. By the way, this
Yeah.
is pretty consistent with the World Happiness Study and others, which was come out. But we are in a period which I would define as both a crisis, an epistemic crisis and a trust crisis, and they're highly connected. There's also a new form of what I call epistemic or ordered populism, which is making this all worse. And a portion of our society, normally a healthy portion, a part of our society, who under certain conditions perceive threat in a way that it produces a normative backlash and unhealthy responses. And this, unfortunately, is what we're experiencing right now. I mean, I was looking at a lot of this in the context of working on a vaccine confidence federal task force, and a lot of the thinking was, well, if we just sit down and explain what's really going on, we'll get this, you know, we'll kind of tell them, well, no, we're not intentionally concealing the real numbers of deaths from vaccine. We couldn't do that even if we wanted to. And no, they don't alter your DNA and so on and so forth. But what we don't realize is there's a systematic portion of society that's not listening and will never listen because they're not plugged into any of the channels we're talking to. Most young men, and there's a much higher incidence of young men who exhibit this sort of disinformed, mistrustful, these characteristics, they're on YouTube every day. This is something, I saw the numbers, when did this start happening? They never look at mainstream news, like never, and they have zero trust in it. And they're getting their information curated through sophisticated forms of algorithmic promulgation, which are coming as both tools of statecraft from other countries and are then being reinforced. This is a new game. This makes Cambridge Analytica look like something totally crude. This is Cambridge Analytica on steroids, and it's only getting more advanced each year, and we're not keeping up. So we better figure this out pretty damn quickly. But in the interim, we better figure out as well that the characteristics which make this possible. Why the resentment to universities and to the professional class? Partly, I think it's because the neoliberal model, the third way models, which were, I think, well-meaning for the most part, that said, get yourself a university education, globalization and information technology are going to float us on this cloud of prosperity. It's all going to be fine. Didn't happen. At best, the new class, the symbolic analyst, as Robert Reich, who now is very apologetic about this, called this, they didn't become the ascendant class. At best, they became the handmaidens of the even more ascendant class of plutocrats and oligarchs that are now running the show. And, you know, this is just the blunt reality. So if there's resentment to the universities, it's probably, to a large extent, rooted in that, and also a model of progressive thinking which abandoned the traditional sort of social justice connection and replaced it with identity politics. The idea, just get your, it'll all be fine. Well, guess what? It didn't work. So we better do some seriously rethinking about how to reformulate it in a way that can speak to the core problem of the collapse of shared prosperity, where everybody feels they have a place that's going to go ahead, which will reduce security. It's not just security; it's a sense of meaning, a place. You know, it's you know, like the Freedom Convoy, by the way, which it was not a fringe. It's 25% of Canadians. I did a paper for the Rural Commission. Sympathize directly with the Freedom Convoy, and there's on certain indicators it's higher. guess what? They are off the charts higher on disinformation. They're off the charts higher on disordered populism indicators. And I'm not talking a little higher. I'm talking 5, 10, 15 times higher. So, you know, how are you going to reach them? By sneering and calling them deplorables, or, you know, a lunatic fringe or whatever. That just adds emotional fuel to an already hot fire. But in the short term, you also can't say, well, let's just do what they say, because it makes no sense. Some of the stuff, you know, the reasons for them being so upset are legitimate, but the prescription for society, like, oh, bodily autonomy, or let's, you know, make Bitcoin a national currency, or whatever, the, you know, the kind of stuff that comes forward, you know, these don't make it. All right, Bitcoin, I'll take that one away. It actually went down again. But anyway, I just think we got to get our game up on that front, but we can't lose sight of the fact. And I give Biden and the group down south full credit for at least they are trying to come up with an analog, a 21st century New Deal. They're talking about a plan that'll produce $4.8 trillion of new revenue from wealth taxes, from taxes on corporation, from taxing the upper 1%, and they're going to put into massive reinvestment into a green economy, a net zero economy, lots of jobs. This stuff is even more popular in Canada. Why aren't we doing it? I don't know. I really don't. It's a good question. I don't understand it. Like it's like 85% support. Do you think that'd be a no-brainer where governments are experiencing the lowest levels of confidence in the direction of the country, lowest levels of trust? Everybody, here's something. Everybody thinks this would be a good idea. Why aren't you doing it? And they go, you're not doing it because you don't want to offend your masters or whatever the other, I don't know what the actual reason. Maybe you're just tone deaf.
So if you're saying that the social and political divides are in many ways fueled by economic disparities, where does that leave us as academic institutions, right? So we know that the pressures on universities by many governments is to become much more focused on labor market results, right? And so is your prescription then that we need to be more like colleges, that we need to focus on those skills? And if so, what are we losing in terms of the research and the innovation that comes from, and just the pursuit of knowledge, lofty and empty as that may sound, is that where we're headed? Are we only destined to be able to help to overcome those social and political divides by being focused on more on an economic reality?
Just a quick comment, because this sort of new gap between the college versus in Canada and the university as a source of kind of controversy, antipathy. It's new and it's unhealthy. We need both, obviously. But in a world where, what was it Moynihan used to say, we can all have our own opinions, but we can't have our own facts. Well, guess what? We all have our own facts now, you know? It's you know, whatever you think is true or someone told you was true, that becomes legitimate. We've got 25% of Canadians think that, not they're dubious or skeptical of climate change, it's made up. This is new. That same percent, when they're asked about forest fires and why they happen, that was arsonists, activist arsonists in the fire. Look, the group that believes that, which is overwhelmingly groups that are kind of interested in the party, which is way ahead in the polls today, they didn't come up with this one morning. You know what? There's bloody arsonists out in the woods setting fires. They were told this. This is an extreme version of the Marjorie Taylor Greene Jewish space lasers crap. But they believe it, you know. And,
so how do you counter it?
How
do you counter that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I find, and I've gone back to people, because I measure the same people in a repeated fashion through time, that people that are moderately disinformed, that just believe some of this stuff, they can, when I push back and say, you know what, you think that governments are intentionally concealing the real numbers of deaths from vaccine, that can't be true, and I explained very quickly in the survey why. 20% of them go, you're right. But we never do that. And if we do it, we aren't getting to them, because we're kind of putting up something on the CBC, which they don't look at, or we're putting up something on a government website, which they don't look at. We have to find a way to get the channels they're looking at, and at least for those who are recoverable, who are moderately disinformed, there's plasticity. They can be recovered, but not by sneering and not by kind of preaching. Mm-hmm. There's lots of evidence coming out that telling people about things that are true rather than telling them that was false is more effective. Providing quiet, safe spaces is there's a reason that Finland has much less of this than any other country in the world, because you know what they do? They go into classrooms when kids are like 7 and 8 years old, and they go through TikTok and they say, this is not true, but I want you to figure out why it's not true. And guess what? They are more inoculated. So there's things we can do, but we're not doing them. Or we're not doing them fast enough.
Okay. Well, one of the things we are doing, though, is to try to focus on this pedagogy of care. And so I'm interested, Doctor, if you would comment on what would a healthy campus look like these days? Because our focus on mental health, not just at Carleton, but certainly in every campus in Canada, has escalated dramatically. We know that we are dealing with students who may be impacted very negatively by disinformation, but we're seeing their mental health just deteriorate so rapidly. Where do we start with that? Because before we can work on their the way in which they interpret data, we also need to be sure that they're in a state of mind where they actually can receive the education and the storytelling and the civil discourse that we want to convey to them.
Yes, so I think, I was going to build on what the Senator said earlier in terms of maybe as a first step toward the pedagogy of care, is that we can't care for people we don't know and have never met and have never had a conversation with. And so I think part of it is finding intentional ways to build that social connectedness. I love this dialogue course that you spoke to, but the levels of loneliness amongst these people who may be living in an echo chamber, much of that echo chamber is virtual, not even in real life. These are, the reality is that many of our young people have very little time in their day where they're actually having real conversations with their friends, let alone with people who think very differently from them, other than perhaps in the classroom, where kudos to you for trying to find ways to enable those conversations with people with whom we disagree. So I do think that there is a huge role for the campus in terms of enabling that ability for social connectedness and connectedness with people who are different from yourself. And it may not happen just on campus, but I'm going to go back to Pierre Trudeau again, and initiatives like Katimavik, and ways that we can intentionally make sure that young people meet people in the country who are very different from them and speak an entirely different language and grew up in an entirely different culture, which is not happening in an organic way right now. And so I think the campus has actually a role to be able to do that.
Can you explain what, I'm sorry, I'm playing the journalist rule. It's bad.
Okay.
Can you just explain what Katimavik is? Because I'm just looking at there's a generation who might not know.
Exactly, yeah. So Katimavik was, I believe it was Pierre that started Katimavik, or was it?
I think so. Might even.
It was, yes.
Jacques Hébert,
yeah. It was Jacques Hébert.
Jacques Hébert and
okay, well, you should tell us.
No, go ahead.
But an extraordinary program of student exchange where students would spend months of time in other parts of the country. One of them at least had to be in Quebec, often in more remote and rural settings as well as in urban settings. But an exceptional program that allowed young people to spend a year literally getting to know other people in the country. And I actually think the post-secondary sector could do an enormous favor to revive a version of that. I'd actually like to make it global, because I think, Canadians really understand very little about the rest of the world. And having lived a lot of my young adult life on another continent, it was entirely formative for me. And I'm sad to say that apart from, travels through Europe, staying in some very nice hostels that exist these days in Europe, young people are not doing the kind of travel and living with and among people that are different from them to the extent that's possible. But if I can just say one more thing in case I don't get a chance to later. This issue of the pedagogy of care is such an interesting one. And I'm going to say again that we need to be very careful that we are not being so insular in our care for ourselves and our learners and our staff and faculty that we don't forget the fact that there are a lot of people in our communities who don't have care. So when Queen's University came to me and said, nobody can get a family doctor in Kingston, 25% of the people don't have a family doctor. Can you please start a clinic for our student staff and faculty? Well, we already have a student clinic, of course, even though it can't quite deal with all of the mental health issues that are there. But I said, I can't in good conscience help start a clinic that would only be for Queens people when I know there are 30,000 people in our community that don't have access to primary care. So yes, I will help create a new clinic that will provide care to 10,000 of the 30,000 people, but it's going to be available to all of the people in our community who lack access to care, because we are actually among the privileged who can usually find a way around it. And I think we have to stop finding solutions that solve things for ourselves and keep repeating this phenomenon that you look out for your own and the rest of the world be damned. Because as we continue to do that, we are not producing the kind of adults who will then start to be able to think and see and understand the way that people that live differently than they do. So I think it's an interesting problem that are on campuses, and I hear about it all the time, but I refuse to think that we can care for ourselves without realizing there are people in the community that are much needier than any of us are.
I'm thinking about the Beatles and how they were singing about all the lonely people.
Exactly.
In the 1960s.
Eleanor Rigby.
But
Yes.
I'm wondering, like, do you think these young people crave connection? Like they're alone. Is it that they don't know how to engage? Like, and what can we do?
Well, I think courses like the ones that the senator is talking about are a good one, and I think the things that you're doing are good, where you're actually saying to students, you can't just hate on another person and decide that they are to be tossed on the waste bin of humanity, but that, because that's what they're hearing everywhere else in their lives. We need to teach them to have these kind of conversations, to say, you think very differently from me, but I don't hate you because of that. In fact, I'd like to understand more. And can you tell me a little bit more about why you think so differently and what got you to those ideas? And the more conversations that you're having like that, I think, are extraordinary. I think we also need to teach students how to receive the messages of disagreement and bordering on hate, and help them figure out how to respond to those messages in a way that doesn't just layer on hurt upon hurt, because they struggle to figure out how to do that. And the concept of actually being able to say that in social media and elsewhere, that people say terrible things to you, that the healthy response to that is not to say an even worse thing back to them, but we have to figure out how to, we have to find grace to be able to care about people, whether they care about us or not, and that's a tough lesson to learn.
Like, I think, Frank, you're painting a pretty dystopian picture, and it's pretty depressing, because it's hard to think, like, how do we get out of this mess?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just going to give you just paint a picture of my own classroom. So last year I taught last year I taught the video journalism class, the third-year class, and I had two students who absolutely despised each other. Like, they really hated each other. Right? They really got on each other's nerves, and it was hard. And on our final day, we produced a newscast, a television newscast, and they were just on each other. Like, it was really, really difficult. Fast forward a year, and I'm teaching the audio journalism, teaching the radio journalism course this year, and these young people have matured, and they have learned how to listen. And they've learned how to.
It's the audio part.
It's the audio part. But I've just seen that develop, that empathy, right? That they've managed to develop. And what it tells me is that things can change.
You're here.
Right? We don't have to be stuck in this place, right? And there are possibilities. So I think it's important for us to kind of talk about the fact that revolution is not instant coffee. Right? It takes time. It's a process, and it's painful, and it's messy, but we have to engage, and we have to be, as we're all saying, I think we have to be more intentional in terms of trying to provide spaces where not just students, but people in the society from different communities can actually get together. Like, how do we do that?
One issue, though, that I think is a real stressor in Canadian universities at the moment is that kind of the accepted wisdom when you get a PhD and you start to teach is, well, nobody really taught me to teach, but I know a lot about a subject, so I'll just kind of walk in a classroom and we'll hope that it all works out. Some of it works out well and some of it doesn't. But I think at the moment that we are seeing a new generation of academics who now are not only being asked to do research and teach, but they're also taking on this care responsibility. And so there is a concern that I have, at least, around faculty mental health as well. So you've got new pressures for people without necessary skills to be able to deal sometimes with complicated mental health concerns. Yes, we have services, but oftentimes a student will want to confide in a faculty member about those kinds of things. So it seems to me to layer another complexity and another stress on the universities as an institution that should be perhaps focused on other things, but we find ourselves as supports in the rest of the society may not be available, and they may be alienating for people from marginalized communities, that a lot of that care work is happening in universities as well. So I'm just wondering if you would concur with that, if you have comments on that. Maybe you're better at it, Adrian, because you've been out and had another career, and now you're here. I don't know, but I think I see it in a lot of young professors that it's a real stressor for them.
Yeah.
Just to reinforce some of the points you make, we track using some clinical indicators as well as just asking people how stressed they are. We use things drawn from like the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Index. And I can tell you that the stress levels have been operating at levels which are unhealthy and abnormal, and they have been for 4 years. And they're much higher amongst young people, particularly younger women, which is interesting. And the gaps there are very large. But when I ask people, are there some areas, and I am optimistic that there are solutions, but they will not come from just kind of trying to stumble through and figure out how this turns out. Oh yeah, look, because I remember if you go to a guy like Timothy Snyder, who's written on tyranny and why it happens, his first chapter in 20 Lessons from the 20th Century was Nobody Sees It Coming. And that is like a common feature, and I don't want our society to be sleepwalking into the kinds of problems which are possible. Not saying they're necessary, but there are alternate outcomes. I mentioned the responses to the same kinds of pressures which were faced in America and Europe produce dramatically different populist responses. And I think if we don't have, and I'm not saying that we have the same options, but I'm saying, maybe we should be looking and choosing wisely and understanding that there are very bad outcomes which can produce the twilight of democracy and the collapse of shared economy and all these but there's also good ones. And that I'll give you one quick finding, which people will find perhaps counterintuitive, but it's overwhelmingly supported by the evidence. The incidence of Canadians who say, I'd like a smaller government that does less things for lower taxes, that's a phrasing which usually leans to, I like smaller government, okay? 60-20 would be the way that would have split at the beginning of the 20th century. The last time I asked it crossed over to even numbers, and for under 35, it was 60-30. I like a bigger government that does bigger things, even with that unpalatable framing. So maybe they're saying we need to look at different institutions to kind of reform this, which are not things which are going to emanate from the private sector, and which individual citizens are not capable because they're just too big and ornery. So, but I think the university, look, if I ask Canadians, what are some of the cross-cutting issues that we should all be looking at? And if it's climate change, there's no agreement anymore. If it's what are we going to do about debt versus investment, no agreement whatsoever. Even what are we going to do in the Ukraine, no agreement. But when I ask about disinformation and polarization and democratic erosion, everybody says that's a huge issue. Consensus transcends partisanship. 90% of Canadians say we should take generative AI out of political campaigns. We haven't, and we're not going to. Why aren't we? That's a massive majority which transcends partisan boundaries. There's all kinds of these examples. Where can we get that? We need research much better than what I'm capable of doing with the stuff I'm coming up with within universities that are wrestling with these problems and coming up with sound answers based on empirical evidence and reason and insight. And I just don't think we're quite keeping up to that challenge, because this Canadians identify this is what keeps us up at night. We don't like what we're seeing around us. We think it could be better, but we don't really know how. Well, maybe the university has a role in as a place where knowledge and truth are supposed to be produced if we have an epistemic trust crisis, maybe the university should be a palliative source of restoring truth and trust in a society where it's gone south.
Pauline, just to answer your question,
Yep.
I think, like I've just been in the classroom for 3 years, and I've been shocked at the number of students that come to me with mental health issues. Like it's every semester there are at least 2 or 3, sometimes more in the class. And I think that there probably needs to be more investment in mental health training. So I need support. I need that kind of training to know how to navigate. And I'm sure my colleagues would concur that they too would like to know, what they can do to support their students. This is the new reality.
Yeah.
It's not something that we can run away from. We have to deal with it. We are, in a sense, and I want to be careful in saying this, but we're kind of first responders in many ways. And so we need to develop the skills of first responders in order to work with these students where they are.
I think if you were, and I don't want to put words in Senator Kuchar's mouth, but you work with Senator Kuchar,
Yes.
so you've probably heard him
Yes.
say this many times.
Yes.
I mean, when you're talking about mental health conditions, the incidence of the actual serious, DSM
Yep.
diagnosed mental illness is not actually all that much higher than it used to be in terms of, people with profound manic depressive illness or schizophrenia. What we're seeing is that whole layer of mental angst and dysthymia that is taking place, and issues like loneliness.
Yes.
And that's the part that's the overwhelming burden, and that actually means that our mental health counselors, whether they're at the student wellness center or wherever else they are, can't manage just that serious mental illness because they're dealing with this massive gap of people who are feeling all of the pressures that we've discussed. And that's where I think the campus can do a lot more to be able to find the methodologies around social cohesion, et cetera. We've done some really interesting work in Kingston with older people that I think is actually translatable to younger people, although I've never seen anyone try it yet. So we have an initiative that started in Kingston and has spread to other places in the country that is working in what we call NORCs, and anybody who works in seniors care might have heard of NORCs. It's naturally occurring retirement communities, which is a very simple methodology that you go into apartment buildings or a neighborhood where there are lots of older people, and you give them 3 things: a reason to connect socially, a reason to get some exercise, and some time to eat healthy food together. And our young people in their little bubbles could really benefit in their naturally occurring young people's communities, where they live side by side with someone that they've never spoken to because they look different and they aren't sure what to talk to them about. But isn't there a way that campuses could find a way to bring young people together, to be able to have purposeful conversations of some sort, to be able to do a bit of exercise together and to eat a meal with people that they might not otherwise know. So I think that there is a lot of room for creativity on campus to be able to create some of those spaces. And it's not going to solve the serious mental health issues, but it is going to solve the fact that people really are struggling to be able to get to know one another, and sitting alone and lonely and feeling hopeless about their lives.
So you've laid out some great practical solutions in terms of services and things that we need to do differently on a campus. But what do we need to do to address some of the trends that Frank has laid out in terms of a research agenda? Because at our core, we distinguish ourselves from other educational institutions as having an important role in research. So when we begin to think about how we can start to stem or reverse some of these trends, give us a research agenda as what you think universities should be looking at.
Well,
Senator,
shall I? Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
One of the fundamental questions that we need to wrap our arms around is the cause of the polarization that has emerged, and whether the economy as we know it, in its state of advanced industrialization, can correct itself. Now, Frank puts forward the view that is correct, that we have agency. I mean, governments and the population can ask our leaders to take bold action to correct course so that there's less disparity, for example, right? I'm an economist, so I wonder how much potential growth there is for us to do that kind of radical redistribution. And I'm not sure about it. I'm not sure that we can grow the pie quickly enough to allow for the kind of distribution that's needed to not just hold down the dissatisfaction, but to even reverse it. Which means I think that we need to also think about new forms of social safety nets. And Frank made the point that post-depression, post-war, there was a flourishing of new thinking around social safety nets, not just the FDR experiment, but in the UK, the Beveridge Commission, right? Unemployment insurance and pensions and all of that. I think we're ripe for that kind of rethinking as well. Well, right now we're just tinkering, right? I mean, look at the disability benefit that came out yesterday. It's $200 a month, right? I mean, you know, like, what's that going to do? I've been an advocate for at least thinking about basic income. I don't know if it's a panacea, but I think there's a case for it. And the case is not so much that that it is the solution for all time, but it may be the solution for the place we are in now, the mature state of the economy with AI potentially causing more job displacement, even highly educated university students not being able to find jobs. Maybe that's a kind of radical social rethinking that's needed, and universities can be at the forefront of this research.
I'll vote for that.
Okay. I'm an advocate for experiments in basic income. Of course, Ontario tried it, then it was abandoned. All of the research that I've seen so far suggests that it does work, and the cost, first of all, on a fiscal basis, it can be managed if you take away some of the refundable tax credits and so on that basically benefit middle class and upper middle class people. But of course, the long-term benefits in terms of the criminal justice system and healthcare and education, they pay for themselves. But we won't really know unless we do a serious experiment that runs long enough to produce those results.
Right. Thank you.
I think we go back to thinking about that era of the Great Society and the Just Society, and this exhilarating concept that social science and other forms of science could be harnessed to actually produce not just quantity and GDP growth, which was all fine at that time, but a better quality, a happier world, a better world, a more just world. It would be interesting to try and restart some of that thinking again. Because, and where would be a better place? Because a lot of that emanated from the academies. This was something which was taken on as a role with some verve, and there was mistakes made. But you know, right now, I mean, I just don't see it confronting. There's some that are like the big questions, like I know I've seen some work, and I don't totally agree with it. But if we're looking at the rates of mental illness in young people, Jonathan Haidt is doing work saying this is strongly related to the sort of hegemony of this new digital era and the kind of disinformation. Now, I don't know if, he actually defended this, showing all kinds of experimental evidence, but you know, we should be finding out, sorting, is that the right question? But why did we see the collapse of shared prosperity? I mean, it's being challenged by some, but the consensus is very strong from people like Martin Wolf, who talks about the crisis of democratic capitalism, or Asmoglu, who talks about why nations fail, or whether it's Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth. These things produce a clear picture which needs to be updated and refreshed. It's just that there are ways of doing things that are very different from what we're doing right now, and they're failing. Those come out of the university. Maybe those voices need to be strengthened. Maybe our response to what are the proper responses to disinformation and polarization. Because I'll tell you, we're not keeping up. At best, we're sort of treading water but the purveyors are doing a better job than we are. And the public are saying, can't you figure this out and figure out some safeguards, some guardrails?
We were having a conversation earlier, though, and we were talking about, I think you were talking about the lack of social solidarity today.
Yes.
And how, I think it was in the 1950s and the 1960s, the tax rate in this country was like 80 to 90%.
Yep.
Can you just mention?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those shibboleths, one of those kind of myths that is allowed to try to just run free. You'll see the response, they're spending money. Well, they're going to get it by raising taxes. Oh, well, that's like crazy. That's madness. And you know, the formula for success is to kind of reduce taxes and the burden of government, and that'll trickle down. That's absolute nonsense. There's no examples where that model has worked in the long run, or even the short run. So, you know, why is that not being challenged? You know, why are we not, you know, why is that not a role of the university? I think they are. Like, for example, I know there's all kinds of troubles in selling the idea of a carbon tax because people can't, really don't. But we had 300 prominent academics that said, no, this is actually the best solution. It's to a problem that's real. But how do you sell that in a world where a quarter of the public say it's made up? By the way, that same portion will tell me in research that forest fires are caused by arsonists, you know, going out and starting them so that they can make you consume a carbon tax, which will be bad for you. This is crazy. But we don't even have a technology to respond to these things now. We're just kind of guessing.
And maybe it's because we haven't put these grand national projects in front of people in the way that we used to. I mean, I love your idea of let's revive the conversation about a great society and a just society. And can't we be the society that can actually, you know, build a modern railroad structure, and as you said earlier, a hydroelectric structure, and can actually create models of universal basic income and test them out and say, let's do big things together. Let's look out for one another. Let's stop, you know, living in our isolated little self-centered existence and say, what can we actually do together to be a great nation? This is an extraordinary land, a land of resources that are unparalleled on the planet in terms of human and natural resources that are available to us. So let us do something great with it together and bring ourselves together across our divisions.
And I'm testing this. I have new data showing supermajority support for national projects of the very type we're not.
And universal primary care, please.
We can throw that one in too. But there's, and you know, people even have ideas how to fund them. And by the way, if we see national identity and attachment to country at the lowest levels they've ever been, by far, it might just be because there's lacuna from the absence of that sort of nation building. Like in Canada, which was based on a different model of nationhood than, you know, places in Europe and even America, which had, you know, common ethno-linguistic roots and a deep history. No, we were based on a form of state nationalism. We built things, the National Railroad, the CBC, Medicare, all of these, multicultural, all of these things remain, although they're eroding, sources of attachment which are diminishing through time. We need to refresh it. And it's not the public don't want to do it. They're saying, yeah, let's do it.
They're waiting for
We're not doing it.
I think part of the problem, though, and I'm probably going to get eggs thrown at me right now, but I think part of the problem in this country is that we've lied about ourselves for a long time. We've lied about our history. We haven't told the truth about where this country came from, right? Like we've talked about this notion of two solitudes, these so-called two founding nations. It was never true. It was never true. And I think that the lack of discussion about the real indigenous roots of this country, that's something that needs to be put on the table. Like this notion that multiculturalism somehow is this new thing, newfangled thing in this country, it's not true. Like there's some 70 languages that are spoken in this country, right? Like this country has always been multicultural, right? It's always been multinational, right? It's actually indigenous folks that taught us how to kind of get along across difference, right? Like there's a lot to be learned from, you know, a lot of the indigenous stories that are here, they're present, but we don't dip into that well enough, right? And I think that that's something that we need to be kind of engaging with and talking about.
Yeah.
Just
One more
a
point.
very quick note on that very point. the multiculturalism, which was part of an official policy in Canada, but also, has become sort of an empirical reality because we have had, obviously our population is going up at a faster rate than pretty well anyone because of immigration, which has largely been successful despite the very serious disruptions in the last couple of years. But there was a famous book came out by an excellent author who turned out to be spectacularly wrong, Neil Basundath, called Selling Illusions. Mm-hmm. And the thesis was that too much multiculturalism would produce ethnic enclaves and would diminish your chances of having a shared national identity. I can show you data which are overwhelmingly compelling based on world values data that I've asked in Canada, that attachment to ethnic group has actually gone down dramatically in the last 30 years, where we've had by far the highest levels of immigration that we've ever had in this country. And meanwhile, attachment, apart from the recent declines, to country has not declined at all. And amongst those groups, there's no difference between their level of attachment. So the whole notion of selling illusions, which was rebooted by Bernier in his kind of campaign a couple of years ago, it's just based on absolute nonsense. It's not true. The empirical evidence is quite the contrary, the exact opposite. So again, this is something where sound research and communication of that research can help dispel these kind of spurious pictures of what we need to be fearful as we move forward as a country. And it should be informed by knowledge and evidence. And that's where the university should be, at least have, because I think there's a huge gap right now in this world where, people can create all kinds of alternate truths. There aren't alternate. There's big T truth. There's all kinds of alternate opinions. There's alternate values. Go for it. But there's not alternate truths. There's just one. And sometimes it's hard to find, but we have to do our very best as a university to be pursuing truth.
So I'm going to invoke my right as the moderator and say that we've had a really interesting conversation that has moved us from talking about turbulence and some quite depressing themes to ending on a moment where we're thinking about big ideas and a new role for the university in some areas. And I'd like to open it up now to the audience for questions. Leo.
On Monday, I had a chance to meet with the Director of Education for the largest public school board in Ottawa, and we were chatting about what were some of the priorities for the largest public school board in Ottawa. And the Director of Education said arts and athletics, because that sort of cultural agenda kind of brings people together. And I think there's been some of that conversation here. And if you read Neatby's history of Carleton University, I mean, this particular geography that we sit on, when we talk about grand national schemes of building a railway, if we could get LRT right, that would be an achievement. But this university sits on very important geography in terms of its future accessibility. And I think it was Yuval Noah Harari who said something to the extent that the disruptor in a world of online division and toxicity is spaces where we come together and we solve isolation, build relations. And is that a research agenda that you could think about? When Roseanne Runta arrived here, she did consultations with people who live in the neighborhood. I live a 10-minute walk from here. And I said, something that Ottawa is unique in that we have no school of urban planning. David Gordon at Queen's has more influence over what happens in the city I live in around big picture planning and history of the National Capital Commission than anyone here. So is that something we could think about, that how is the space that we occupy here, what could we do to be more deliberate in terms of engaging? And the downtown is just going to crumble, but we've let other things crumble as well, like the RA Center, which was about engaging federal public servants around arts and culture and sport, and we've allowed that to kind of be run into the ground. So maybe that's something we could think about.
Let's pick up a few questions and then have the audience respond as they see fit.
So my question, I guess, pertains to sort of the demographic makeup of this room, which I find is probably going to be true of society in general. Universities are usually attended, the majority, by younger people. There's going to be a lot less younger people as we go forward. How relevant will universities be in the future, in the next generation or two?
Maybe one more, and then we can have some comments back.
I feel compelled to ask a question as director of the School of Canadian Studies. If you look closely, Canadian Studies in Turbulent Times, and I feel like perhaps we haven't addressed that in a way that would be appropriate to giving us some answers as to which direction Canadian Studies should go. What I'm hearing is more about questions about the study of Canada as opposed to Canadian Studies. And I was intrigued by the one solution that would see young Canadians scattered throughout Canada and more optimistically throughout the world, in the same way that the Canada Corps was put in place unsuccessfully by the Liberal government and so on. And we also have, a variety of different university organizations that work globally. But my point of view would be that if you're going to send young Canadians abroad, they need to be literate, and they need to understand what Canada is and what it is not. And they need core competence in the basic areas that we think would help us better understand Canada. And so one task I think that's important for those who study Canada is to create an environment where they are prepared to engage, so they are perhaps not speaking a common language, but at least prepared to understand from some baseline assumptions about what Canada is and what it's not. Otherwise, you may find yourself replicating the kind of ignorant assumptions, or the veil of ignorance, if you will, that you speak of. And so I'm kind of curious, at the high school level, you talk about a practical solution. The Ottawa Carleton District School Board is taking the big three to court. They're suing social media companies. And the solution here isn't to get justice from feeling good about taking them to court, but I think to get money back so that you can invest in the kind of projects you're talking about, which might be dialogue-based, might be sort of providing a corrective to disinformation and so on. But there is a kind of a virtuous circle that could be achieved here with the partners we often identify as our adversaries, in this case, social media. And that's the kind of solution I think that we'd want to pursue. I did have one question about it, the research agenda for the senator, but others as well. Are we anchored too tightly or too closely to the United States when it comes to finding ourselves in the world, our innovation, our capacity to be productive, our growth strategies seem to be firmly anchored in the trajectory the United States is taking, in particular their security agenda. We find ourselves perhaps foreclosing on options that would see our innovative capacity thrive. And that means perhaps taking some tough decisions about who we should and should not be working with. I'm talking about technological advancements where the United States is not a leader, but other countries that we consider to be adversaries are.
That's quite a range for you
That's a
to
lot
take
of
on. So why don't we go across the panel, and if there are comments that you'd like to make to any of those questions, please feel free. Jane, would you like to start?
That is a range. I can't pick up on all of them at the same time, but I'm going to go back to the first gentleman who talked about sort of the coming together of neighborhoods, I think was where we were at, and your comments from the school board saying that, the things that our students need are the arts, and I'm not sure whether you mentioned music, but all of the things that bring people together in social ways. And I really think that there is that universities could have an exceptional role in trying to facilitate some of that work. One of the things that I'm going to have one more plug around universal access to primary care. And one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about the fact that we need to have neighborhood hubs of care, and I liken them to the concept that we have neighborhood schools, and every geographic region in the entire country knows that your children can go to a school where they will be able to get public education, but we've never organized our care centers in this way, and that I actually think we need to organize primary care and health and social services into neighborhood hubs so that there will be a place where everyone will know that they can go together to be able to get access to care. And that can be not just your family doctor, but that can actually also be the place where if you're struggling with housing, if you haven't been able to fill out a tax form and therefore can't get access to social services, that you're going to have a single site in communities. And there's no reason why universities can't play a much bigger role in try to doing this. Kingston's small enough that we've been able to do this and develop a plan where we want to develop hubs, and we've worked with the local hospitals and the city of Kingston and the university and the doctors to be able to say, let's actually establish a center where we're going to be able to provide healthcare plus. And I think we should be trying to do that, maybe linking them with our schools. But social cohesion is something that has continued to ring up amongst our conversations here. And Frank would be the expert in as society has become more diverse, we haven't had the same sort of gathering places that we had in my youth, at least, which was typically often the church or the other places of worship where people would gather. And as people have increasingly left those places of worship, or at least done that more privately again, there hasn't been a place for people to gather. So I would put out a challenge to us as universities to work across other sectors within our spaces to say, can't we help be the catalyst to establish sites of social cohesion where our students can not only help to do the research as to what impact that will make, but can actually be the places where they'll volunteer and come to understand their community better.
Thank you. Senator Wu, would you like to comment on any of these questions?
Well, just to say, bowling alone, right?
Yes.
Still a problem 20 years ago, still a problem today. I'll just pick up on the two questions from David. First on Canadian studies and what relevance it might have for Canadian studies. I'll just offer one slice of how I think it might be relevant. We've already talked about this word was not used, but the parochialism of Canadians. I think Dr. Philpott raised it. Canadians don't know a lot about Canadians in other parts of the country, but they know even less about the world, even though they're not really aware of that. In fact, most Canadians would identify themselves as being pretty internationalist and pretty plugged into the world, but they do it by proxy. And what I mean is that they assume they're plugged into the world because we have a diverse population, therefore they know the best Chinese restaurants in Toronto, and they know where to get a good falafel, but that doesn't substitute for being knowledgeable of the world. And in fact, the data on Canadian students who spend time abroad as part of the education bears this out. It's, I think, 6% compared to double digits in other Western industrialized countries. So one angle of thinking about Canadian studies, a new angle, is to think about Canadians abroad. I am releasing, you heard it first here on Monday, a new commission study on Canadian expatriates, Canadians who live abroad. And you may be surprised to know that there are between 4 and 5 million of them. That is bigger than most provinces. Just think about it. 4 to 5 million Canadians living outside of the country. And because we passed a bill a few years ago that gives them the right to vote, even if they've lived abroad for more than 5 years, they have actual power. I mean, I don't know if they'll swing ridings, but if many of them took up the vote, it would be significant. But what we don't do is think about them as an asset for the country. We generally think about Canadians abroad as a contingent liability. What I mean by that is that we think about them when we need to evacuate them in a time of crisis. Lebanon, Gaza, any other conflict zone, they come up as kind of, oh my God, Canadians abroad, how do we get them out, you know? But really, if we've got 4 or 5 million Canadians living overseas who identify as Canadians, what is the government doing to embrace them as part of our citizenry? I think there's a huge research agenda there that can be explored. And then on your other question, it's a very big topic. All I would say at this, because it's a little bit tangential, but it's relevant in the sense that it's about where our future is. And what I would say is that while this government and previous governments have talked about the importance of Canada diversifying its trade and investment away from over-reliance on the United States. The path we're on is going to mean even greater dependence. Notwithstanding the Indo-Pacific strategy and CETA and all of the other things we're doing in other parts of the world, the single most important economic policy that we are pursuing right now, which is not said, is a continentalist strategy that's piggybacking on American protectionism. In other words, we are following the American lead of trying to have a fortress North America that will bring jobs back to America, bring manufacturing back, and Canada is desperately trying to make sure that it's not excluded from the privileges and the preferences that are given to American companies. What that will surely mean is that the gravitational pull of economic activity will be within the continent. And that may be the best strategy for us if the world is breaking up into regional blocks. But we're placing a big bet there. And my own bet is that we should continue to think about diversification, but we have to do it in a way that that gives us continued access to the US without following every preference that they have. We are in, a geopolitical tussle between the US and China, principally. There are things that the US is pursuing with respect to China that make sense and that we might well want to follow. But there are other things that are not in our national interest. And if we start thinking about what our national interest is, I don't know. I don't know that we want to be sailing through the Taiwan Strait, for example. I don't know that that's in our national interest per se. I don't know that we want to piggyback on certain types of trade actions or prohibit, as you point out, research collaboration with leading edge universities and companies in countries that are deemed to be taboo to the United States. So there are choices we have to make, and they should be driven by the national interest rather than what our neighbor to the south suggests.
Can I just pick up on something that you said? Because I think our worrying lack of interest in the world, our lack of curiosity, manifests itself in the fact that I think today there are fewer Canadian foreign correspondents than in the last maybe 50, 60 years. Right? The number of foreign correspondents has really plummeted. And I think that has an impact on the discourse. Right? It has an impact on the way in which we talk about, like the fact that we don't even have, I think CBC doesn't have a foreign correspondent in Africa. Right? There's no foreign correspondent, for example, in South America. Right? Like that has an impact on how we imagine these spaces in the world, how we talk about them.
Frank.
Just on that last point, the problem is even deeper. We have our media in Canada 15 years ago got 90% of its revenue from ads that they sold in Canada. It's less than 10% today. Worse, all that money's flows out of our country, but now it's coming back in many cases in some of this toxic, dysfunctional disinformation. And you don't even have the basic inoculation from local journalism and other sources, because we find that in local communities or rural communities, propensity to be ill-protected from disinformation is even higher. On the issue of sort of our place in the world, it's clear that, and if Canada is following the American path, in some ways it is, some it isn't. I've studied this pretty carefully. I've worked for every American ambassador back to Giffen and in a formal relation. It's been a lot of fun. But I can tell you that what we've seen recently are some really dramatic shifts. The incidence of Canadians who say the relationship with the United States is positive has gone from 10% to 70% in a straight line. And it wasn't just the kind of re-election, not the re-election, the dismissal of Donald Trump. There's more to it. I think they're looking. We found as well that the desire to strengthen relationships, say, with China, which was picked as a first choice by Canadians only 10 years ago, has declined precipitously even before some of the recent troubles in a way that it's non-existent today. Now, Canadians still say we want to be free traders, whether the three stools of, globalization, immigration, foreign direct investment, and trade liberalization are all in place, I'm not so sure. Immigration seems to be severely challenged recently. But I think free trade, but what we're seeing is a belief that maybe that's a stronger North American idea. Not necessarily a fortress, I think more perhaps a mosaic, but Canadians now are receptive in ways that they haven't been in a long time to the idea that maybe we need to be doing more things together with North America on energy, security, climate, and so forth. So that idea seems to maybe producing more resonance as geopolitical tensions have risen and the receptivity or sense. Now, just to conclude this, the young Canada has a very different outlook on the external world than the rest of the country. And I've seen this in recent work I've been doing and looking at support for increasing spending on NATO, for example, or Ukraine, or concerns about what Vladimir Putin might be saying. Young people are just not plugged in, and I've seen evidence that American youth, as well as maybe America more broadly, are disengaging. They're returning to a more isolationist perspective. The idea that, that we can be champions of the advanced Western world and safeguards of democracy and all that, it's lost a lot of its luster because of what's going on. Now, I hope that's not infecting Canada, but I do see that playing out very strongly. Young people, they're not concerned about defense spending. They're not concerned about NATO. They are concerned, by the way, the one exception to this is, and it's a very different kind of response to the Middle East. We look at young people are engaged by the issues in the Middle East, but they flip the order of the relative salience and sympathy for Israel versus Palestine. Whereas for most Canadians, it's pretty equally divided. But as for younger Canadians, it's more sympathy relative to Palestine, which you see, I think, playing out in universities, and perhaps playing out more insidiously in rising anti-Semitism, which we can measure. So anyway, so it's a complex and swirling mixture of forces. Some opportunities, some of them hopeful, some of them less so. But again, the idea that this is like something that's not moving rapidly is an idea that we can kind of put away and realize if we're going to provide responses to these which are plausible, we have to show far more agility and understanding changes which are moving at a rate that we have never seen, at least I've never seen in a very long career.
Great. I think we have time for one final round of questions. So if I could get, wow, that's a lot of hands, people. If I could get our microphones to say 3 more people, that would be great. So over here first.
Hi, my name is Eduardo Boletti. I work here at Carleton. I picked up on the title, Turbulent Times, and I think that there was a great mention of how fast times are now changing. And it wasn't really part of the discussion earlier. We did mention different types of social media. We talked about generative AI briefly. But the challenge here is our lack of speed, a lack of agility to be able to innovate, to be able to adjust. See that at the university, see that at the city level, see that throughout government. I want to know, what is it that can we do? I mean, I want to talk about a lot of things with you guys. The leadership component, the lack of leadership that has vision for our nation is something that younger people for sure notice. I notice, I'm younger, I'm 39, but we don't have leaders who talk about what we want to become. Where are we going 2050? Where are we being 2100? What are we going to be as a society? We don't have those conversations here. But I wanted to find out, what can we do to be more agile, to be able to put in place structures, both at the democratic level, to be able to have better governance, as well as to be able to adjust and to be aware and to be able to experiment in a much more intelligent way than we do have the systems today. Okay. That's my question for you.
Okay, and then a question here in the second row.
Good evening. Second row from the back, right?
Sure.
So I just wanted to quickly ask, what stock do you put in the research or curriculum agenda to economies of addiction? I'm going to go home inevitably and scroll Instagram for an hour, and that's the primary means by which most people are getting their news nowadays. and a lot of these apps and subscription services are based on retaining as much information as possible. So I was just wondering how much stock you put into that when you're examining a lot of the symptoms that I'm seeing here: sadness, anger, polarization, disinformation.
Right. And one more here at the front.
I'd like to ask a question about what I consider to be dead money. We're living in an economy where 5% of our population owns a prohibitive amount of the wealth in this country. That's one thing. The other thing is that no matter who I listen to, whether it's people in the illegal occupation or whether it's young people serving me in stores, if I put them in a place where I empower them, I see them as superior to me, I find nothing but altruistic responses from them and a willingness to communicate. The problem is not the ordinary people. And what I want, I think it's a great country. We have great people here. So what I want to know is, what are universities doing to define this disparity of wealth? And what research are they doing to develop more equitable ways of distribution so that we can have the health care, the happiness, the reporters throughout the world that we need?
Okay. Thanks so much. So I'm going to give you a chance to respond to those, and I think then we will close off the evening because you've been very generous with your time, but I'll give each of you a chance to offer some observations. Adrian, let's start with you.
I'd like to, Mr. Villetti, I don't want to be glib, but we have to be the leaders that we want to see. I don't think we can wait for leadership to emerge, and I think that young people have tremendous energy and ideas, and we know if we just look at history, young people have changed this world, over and over and over again. Young people have often, have always been ahead of the curve. And I just think, for example, of, Martin Luther King was 26 years old in 1955, right? And helped to spark a revolution, right? And when we think about all the changes that took place in the 1960s, a lot of the people who were at the forefront of those movements were younger than you. I think you said you're 39. They were much younger than you were, and they helped to change things. So I think that we have to provide young people with as much support and encouragement and as we can, and hopefully they'll lead the way.
Frank?
I have one idea that I've been, trying to sell this with all my limited skills for a long time, and I have not had that much success. I've had a few successes. I do a form of research where we create a rigorously representative random probability sample. I won't get into how difficult that is, but it can still happen. And instead of just asking, what do you think of the budget, or, do you think we should be spending more money on this or that? I do those questions, but I also give them a basic package of information, okay, which is impeccably impartial, which is reviewed by a number of, experts to ensure that I'm giving that, which is consumable, which is digestible. It doesn't take them, a month to read it. It takes them 20 minutes. And then I say, okay, what I'd like you to do now is not tell me your top of mind public opinion. I want you to provide advice to decision makers. I'm giving you a seat at the table, and I want to say, what do you think we should do on this issue, be it polarization? I've used this, for example, in the Romano Commission. We did this large deliberative exercise. It cost a fortune, about $1 million, took a year to do. I can do the same thing now in a week, maybe 2 weeks, for a fraction of the cost. Probably just about as well. I've used it for electoral reform. I've used it. Every time I've used it, the public wisdom that comes out of this is remarkably consistent with the expert consensus. It's uniformly humane, rational. You provide and what I do is is giving them the little information. I tell them in the next session, here's what everybody else thought.
you can now change your opinion based on what everybody else thought. And so they iteratively can refine their views. And what it does is it gives them an ability to give informed, reflective advice to decision makers. Why isn't this a routine part of the way we do government that is provided to both politicians and officials on a regular basis, instead of saying, every 4 years you get a kick at the can, you can then get rid of a government or not. No, you should be able to have ongoing input of this sort, which honestly, it works great. I have no idea why it's so. I hear things like, well, we're the elected officials, we'll figure it out. No. This is it actually expands the role of parliamentarians, who are basically there just sort of providing, issues on, funding of bills and so forth. This allows you to kind of see what your constituency thinks. It gives you informed, reflective, and representative input. And by the way, when the public do this, they say, this is great. I'd love to do more of this. Why don't we do this more often? And, it's, as I say, the time is ripe to include this as a routine part of living governance. I have no idea why I've been so dismally unsuccessful in selling this idea, because it always works great. And I think the current times would be a perfect place to use this on an ongoing basis to deal with the questions we've been talking about today.
Okay, thank you. Senator Wu.
Well, you should run with that idea, I think.
I'll run with that one too. I'm making a list, yeah.
Could I just say one thing? It's a little tangential, but we've talked about disinformation and toxic behavior and so on. I know this talk is being recorded. I don't know if it will be made public. Perhaps it will be. I'd be interested to see if some of what we've said is weaponized in some way and used as a form of disinformation or propaganda and so on. Just to put it out there, because it happens. On the question of what can be done, I'm not very optimistic about grand national projects, certainly not in the current environment, whichever party might come to power. So I'm looking to local level leadership, maybe at the province or municipal level, maybe perhaps particularly municipal level. I'm looking to leaders in domains where they have control over their domain, universities, right? University presidents and so on. I'm looking for courage and leadership from these sources of reasonably autonomous decision-making that can make an example for the country to follow. So I'm working with a municipality in British Columbia right now to see if we can launch a basic income experiment, because the province as a whole won't do it. The country as a whole, we're far away from it. But if we can do it at the municipal level, maybe that will provide a demonstration effect. On the question of debt capital, that's a very, very good question. It's even deeper than what you described, because the debt capital also is held in corporations, very, very large corporations that have massive cash surpluses that they are not reinvesting, partly because they don't see the returns. Well, if they saw returns in financialization of the investments, like financial type investments, they would do it, but markets are not that hot right now. So they're holding on to the cash horse, but they're certainly not investing in productive activity, innovation, for example. And that's partly why we need to think about new economic models and new social security nets that try and get around this problem. We're talking about trillions of dollars that are held by, particularly in the United States, right? Large corporations. And it is debt capital. They may distribute to the shareholders from time to time or reward their employees with more generous pay packages. But we have to think about the social cost of not redeploying this capital. And that is partly a function of tax policy. So what we saw in the budget is a very, very small attempt to try and utilize, to correct the balance. But we also need to think about new types of social safety nets that deal with the new reality of employment in the labor market.
Great. And you were kind enough to start the evening
Wow,
for
you're
us, and
gonna
I'm
give me
going to
the-
give you the last word.
Okay. So I'm going to say 3 quick things. First of all, I just wanted to respond to the person in the back of the room and honor the question, even though I don't have a good answer to it, around the addictive nature of social media. I think it ties in very much with the conversation that we've been having, and I would hypothesize that one, there are all kinds of reasons for why it is addictive, and not least of which is the powerful money that goes into in making it addictive. But it also ties in with some of the things we've been discussing around loneliness and an insufficient amount of social, in real life social networks. So as I say, I don't have an answer, but it was a fantastic question that we should explore somewhat. Second thing I wanted to say is I love your idea, Frank. I think, I've always been interested in direct democracy, but I think direct democracy has a lot of challenges, but your version of an iterative approach to direct democracy is fantastic, and I absolutely would love to see that employed to a greater extent. My last comment is going to go to the gentleman who spoke about leadership and the real challenges that we have around not having the kind of leadership that will impress upon us the grand national vision. And you're not a believer yet in the fact that I think it's possible that we can get that.
We'll work on it.
Instead, what we're getting is leaders who are being rewarded for being terrible to one another and saying hateful things, not only to each other, but to journalists, and scoring points out of speaking with such the kind of disdain that we would never accept a child speaking to another child in that manner, and yet politicians speak like that, and somehow they raise money off of it. So my last comment then will be that in recognition of Vickers and Verdun, the 2 feminists who started this series, I will propose to you that what we need to do is get women leaders in this country, because I do believe that fundamentally it is less likely that women will treat each other with that kind of horrific disdain, and that we need a healing women's touch to bringing this country back together again.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. So let me start the thank yous then for the evening. First of all, a thank you to the School of Canadian Studies for the invitation to all of us for this evening. So thanks to David Carment, and thanks to the professional staff from Canadian Studies for taking care of a myriad of tasks that we don't even know what went on behind the scenes. So thank you very much, Donna Malone. Let me thank most sincerely our panelists for a free-flowing, engaging conversation, very interdisciplinary, drawing from the past to understand the contemporary and looking forward into the future, which is really the essence of the project of Canadian Studies and always has been. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to the audience for your attention and your engagement and ongoing conversations about turbulent times. Thanks so much.
And thank you, Pauline. Thank you, Pauline, for